those movements. As I mentioned yesterday, we have finished studying 12 experiences, and this week we are considering experiences in 3 countries. Yesterday we considered and studied Lebanon. Today we're going to talk about Palestine directly and particularly about Hamas, and tomorrow and after tomorrow it's going to be about Yemen. We have 2 sessions today. The first is about Hamas and the combination of politics and resistance, and then followed by the afternoon session in studying the experience in terms of lessons learned and future prospects. This morning we are going to have 4 speakers. The first is going to talk about an evaluation of the experience from within the occupied territories, that is internally. Then an evaluation of the experience in the diaspora, i.e. from the point of view of Palestinians in the diaspora. Then we have an intervention about the challenges of governance in Gaza and the prospects, and the fourth is about the politics and resistance and the combination thereof. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Youssef Rizqa, who is a professor of literature and criticism in Gaza University, has a number of publications in jurisprudence, politics, and religion, and he summarized the experience of Hamas in a book in 3 volumes, and he also writes on a daily basis, and he also worked as a minister of information in Palestine in the 10th government, and he is also working for the Ministry of Endowment, and he used to be a political advisor to the former Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh until 2014. The second intervention or presentation which is about the evaluation of the experience in the diaspora by Mr. Ahmed Yusuf, who is the Secretary General of Mahmad al-Hikma in Gaza, and he was also an advisor to Ismail Haniyeh, the former Prime Minister, and also a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also a professor in politics and political sciences. And he is also a member of many political and intellectual and media institutions, and previously also he worked for a studies center in Washington, D.C. He issued a number of publications in English and Arabic about the Islamic movement in Palestine, the Arab world and Islamic world, and also the problematics of dialectics of Islam and the West. The third presentation about the challenges to governance in Gaza by Mr. Muhammad Ibrahim, who has a higher diploma in public relations and media and a bachelor in administration in Gaza and a master's degree and PhD in human resources from Bradford University in the UK. He currently works as the head of the Academy of Studies and Policies and the head of strategies and policies, and between 2011 and 2014 he worked as the Minister of Youth and Sports. He has experience in academia as a vice dean and an associate professor in 2 universities, including the Islamic University in Gaza. This fourth speaker is going to present about the challenges in Gaza by Dr. Ra'id, who is the head of the Contemporary Center for Policies and Studies and the head of planning and development for the master's program in this center, and also he specialized in political studies and published more than 60 refereed studies, and he works particularly in politics of Palestinian processes, and he is particularly interested in Palestinian partisan work, civil society, and political processes in Palestine. After those four speakers, we are going to have two commentators to comment on those presentations. The first is going to be Mr. Idris Sabouh from Algeria. He's got a BA in political science from Abbas Darour University, in addition to a medical degree from another university, and he also has many interests, including his professional interests in medicine, as he worked as a physician for more than 20 years, in addition to being a member in service providing and health institutions, but he was also active in intellectual, academic, and political arenas. And he currently works as a coordinator for the media and justice forum, and he's also the head of the Afro-Asian forum in Istanbul, and he's also a prolific writer in many papers and a columnist in many papers. And another comment by Dr. Hussam Adrani, who is a researcher who worked in the General Commission of Information in the Office of the Palestinian President, and he was also a researcher in decision-making unit in and planning in Gaza. He also worked as a diplomat in the Foreign Affairs Office in Palestine, and he's also a part-time writer in many newspapers and publications. He has many publications and studies. His PhD thesis was about the concept of state in the thought of the resistance movement Hamas. Thank you all for being with us. Our first speaker, Dr. Youssef Rizqa, is going to talk about Hamas as an experience from within. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, praise be to God, and peace and blessings be to Prophet Muhammad, his companions, and his family. I would like to start with greeting and thanking Dr. Sami Al-Arian and the organizers from the Center of Islam and Global Affairs in Sabah Din Zaim in Istanbul, and those who are coordinating these symposia on the evaluation of Islamic movements in governance and politics. And I would like to also welcome all the speakers on this session. I would like to start by saying that this study considers the experience at two phases. The first, at the time they won the January 2006 elections and ended in June 2007, which lasted for a year and a few months, and in which the 10th and 11th government were the first was Hamas government, and the other was based on the Mecca Accord, and both governments have run both and governed both the West Bank and Gaza without division. The second phase started in June 2007 to date, when Hamas took control by force of Gaza Strip, and they were and Ismail Haniyeh was voted out of prime ministry in the West Bank, and Haniyeh's government became an acting government according to the de facto authority by virtue of that decision. The most important event at the time was the concession by Ismail Haniyeh of his government in favor of a national unity government headed by Rami Hamdallah, who did not or refrained later from taking control of Gaza for phony pretexts, which forced Hamas to form a de facto acting government to govern the place, and they refused reinstalling Haniya's government or installing a new government to avoid multiplicity of governments and in order to avoid further division, and this continues to be the case to date. This has been the general framework and the general outline for the evolution of governance at the time of Hamas without details. But now let us look at some milestones in those two phases. First of all, the national governance experience in Palestine was short-lived, as it started with the Oslo Accord in autonomy in Gaza and the West Bank, while they used to fall under Jordanian and Egyptian governance before that. Abu Ammar also formed the first government in 1996, and between 1996 to 2006, Fatah ran 9 governments headed directly by Abu Ammar or by a prime minister who is closely associated with him after the establishment of the position of a prime minister, but with pressure from donors. Third, there are a number of factors that made those governments failed, which are corruption, monopoly of decision-making, which led to a decline in public support, which caused the success of Hamas in 2006. Fourth, in 1996, Hamas did not engage and participate in the elections in 1996, but they participated in 2006 because the political reasons that prevented that were gone, and they were able to overcome the question of the combination between resistance and governance, and also with the what has become that Oslo Accord was unjust and needed to be ended and was not honored anyway, and that to treat and address corruption was more becoming than sitting aside and just criticizing corruption. Fifth is that the Hamas started this government with all good faith and started to look for confidence by the parliament, but Hamas, by experience, found that its ambitions are one thing and reality was another, as they ran into a crisis in governance. Most importantly was the lack of recognition by Israel, US, and European Union with the Hamas government and imposing the quartet conditions on this government. Second, the siege from the West on this government to suspend developmental projects to topple this government and go to early elections in which Fatah would triumph. Third is to stop peaceful power devolution and sharing and tearing apart the constituency of Hamas by presenting Hamas as the body that brought on in the siege on those people. It was those factors that took the experience away from the government program, the preset program, and they had to deal with those issues with which ended with the military confrontation in 2014 and with division. So the first and second Ismail Haniya government had no safe environment to maintain power and maintain their government program. In 1996, in 2006, they tried to create a national coalition government, but they failed. And they failed to build another government based on the Mecca Accord. And after division, also they failed in creating another government. And the reasons for this failure its causes are detailed in my research. This experience says that Hamas has been able to maintain its grip on governance and was able to cooperate with its constituency and with other movements, but this experience came at the intersection or the conjunction of division, which diverted it from its program and its good governance issues. Nonetheless, they succeeded in some issues that I will present later. After presenting this combination between resistance and governance, after they started with the banner, a hand that resists and a hand that builds. After 3 months of this government, they started the operation in which they imprisoned Gilad Shalit, after which Israel responded fiercely on Gaza and started its siege and put Gaza in developmental and crisis. And there were also the 4 successive wars between Gaza and the occupation army and what came through it, including the siege on the residents. In both cases, Hamas was able to succeed in some fields, but the strategic mistake that the PLO has done in signing the Oslo Accord before liberation, making PLO hostage to the occupation, was a major mistake. But as for the successes and failures, the government has succeeded in managing the government, the e-government, and facilitation of service provision, capacity building, facing up to unemployment, stopping corruption and illicit profit making, and was able also to build, after 2007, police corps that are built on the right doctrine, and also address the issues in education, endowment, health, and elsewhere, and were able to coordinate between the West Bank and Gaza and provide the judiciary with capacities, and fought and combated all infiltrations, and worked with Qatar to rehabilitate roads and to support families of martyrs, and struck a balance between that and protecting the weapons and arms of the resistance, and maintained appropriate relations with Arab countries. However, it was unable to develop political systems and to deliver on its electoral pledges because of the aforementioned reasons, and was unable to dissociate the Palestinian economy from Israel, and was unable to remove the siege on Gaza and to maintain Arab relations for a long time, and was unable also to reach a point where new general elections would be held to resolve the conflict through the ballot. But in order to assess success and failure, first of all, that Hamas was partner to this, and that there were assessments all along. One of the outcomes, according to my evaluation of this experience, first of all, the Islamists have to participate in governments and elections because this participation, although risky, it is the most appropriate and the most suitable way of participating in the democratic life. And boycotting democracy or boycotting elections are riskier and have graver outcomes. Second, the participation of Islamic movements in governance give it opportunities to win over a further constituency and give its cadres and personnel experience in running international relations and diplomatic posts. The program offered by Hamas was too ambitious and unrealistic, and when it started in governance, it was forced to understand what realism was, and this was an important lesson that it wouldn't have learned without going into governance. Third, it is important to take into consideration that Israel itself tries to fail the Islamic experiences, and this applies to Hamas in addition to other geographically distance experiences such as Sudan, Turkey, and Egypt. Fifth, also all the countries are in agreement in not allowing Islamists to take power or succeed in taking power. And when they do take power against their will, such as in Gaza, Sudan, Egypt, or elsewhere, those democratic experiences in the Middle East are expected to fall into the Western standards, and there is no tolerance for those who work to govern with Islam. Another point is that Islamists in the Middle East have to engage in the armed forces, the police, and other bodies and institutions of the state in order to protect the state when Islamists take power, because it turns out that it is those bodies that fail the country when Islamists take power democratically. This happened in Egypt and elsewhere, and an attempt was made to do so in Turkey as well. Also, Islamists have to refrain from taking power alone and to engage in national unity or coalition governments in order to further establish the democratic stability and power sharing. Islamists have also to refrain from foreign aid, because this foreign aid may turn out to be a burden on them, and there are no moral guarantees that they would persist if any conflict arises between the interests of those states and local governance. And this was clear in Hamas's experience and or PLO's dependence on foreign aid, and all this aid was suspended on the following day of the elections in which Hamas won the elections, which shows the political side to this assistance. Also, the democratic and political situation in the Arab countries in the region is precarious, and a democratic power sharing creates a new environment that is more stable. And also, any political authority in Palestine needs to be developed and has to separate powers and enhance the rule of law and the superiority of the constitution. This can only be done through a stable government of coalition or coalition government. The 10th, leaving the PLO was a main mistake that had its toll both on the PLO and Fatah and Hamas. The affiliation of PLO economically and financially to the occupation, be it by through the checkpoints, export and import, the banks, does not allow for a sovereign independent governance, and getting rid of this affiliation or this satellite state needs to be a priority. 12th, the Arab systems and regimes do not support Islamic governance, even in Palestine, in confrontation of Israel. Hence, Hamas was unable to overcome the Arab veto. Although Ismail Haniya's government hence never received any support except from Qatar for humanitarian purposes. The 13, the combination between resistance and governance is not impossible. It is possible when you have enough power to confront the enemy and impose yourself as a strong actor and player. And Hamas was able, in its legal and logistic capacities, to take up this combination and paid for this from its ranks and constituency, and worked in raising awareness for the importance of this strategic options. 14th, in Hamas's experience in governance, there is a functional division between the government and the movement. So the government would govern the population, the education, health, judiciary, while the resistance undertakes defense of Gaza and managing the conflict with the occupation, and does not intervene in civilian affairs of the population, so that it does not bear the responsibility for any failure. 15th, the success or the persistence of this government, even in Gaza itself for so long, was because of the success of Hamas itself, as well as the constituency, particularly in the presence of a military force to protect it, in addition to supporting constituency. In many other experiences, it was clear that this is an important factor, and Islamists have to be prepared to make those prerequisites available for themselves. This is a summary of my study in evaluating the experience from within. I hope it was useful, and I hear some enriching remarks and comments. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for SIGA again. Thank you so much, Dr. Yusuf, for this presentation, which was quite concise. You abided by the time. At the same time, you were clear and detailed. Dr. Yusuf, in his study, said that evaluation would be about the time when Hamas took governance and took power after the elections, and there were two governments between 2006 to 2007, and it was a Hamas-only government and followed by another coalition government, but both were not successful because of what he called a coup, or a conflict that ended with Gaza taking over Gaza and taking sole power of Gaza until 2014, when the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Ismail Haniya, conceded power, and then there was a governmental void that ended up with the establishment of a new de facto or acting government, which is a committee that runs and governs Gaza to date. And then he said they used a functional division of power as the movement was responsible for facilitating and service provision for the population. And then he talked about the different governments since Oslo between 1990 to 2006. 9 governments run by Abu Ammar, but they were either too corrupt or incompetent, or the decision was totally monopolized. And he said that Hamas did not participate in the 1996 elections for various reasons, but it engaged in the elections in 2006 because they deemed that Oslo was virtually dead and killed by Israel itself. He said there were a number of points to be considered. First of all, Islamists have to consider always engaging in elections, because engagement or participation, although it is risky, it is the most effective and the best way for the community and for democracy. The second point was that Islamic movements' participation in governance give them the chance to win over further constituency cross sectors. Third, that it is the occupation that is the main problem in the face of Islamic experiences, because they don't want them to participate or they want to fail them, and this applies to Hamas and other Islamic experiences, and that the US and the bulk of Europe agree on not wanting Islamists to engage in government, and that Islamists have to engage in the army and the police, because these are auxiliary forces that need to be present to protect the Islamists in government, and that they should avoid being in governance on their own and try to be in coalition governments, and have to refrain from foreign aid, which may be a trap for them, and that the partisan and democratic situation in Palestine and Arab states is still nascent and precarious and faces many challenges, and that there were many institutions that require restructuring and reform, and that the PLO's decision to sign the Oslo Accord before liberation was a major mistake. Actually, this is a point that requires a question on whether the elections were a mistake themselves, and the presence of PLO and this contradiction that was there. So can there be any elections when you don't have a political entity or when you are in a national liberation phase? But this is a question that the doctor can answer at the end, and also that this affiliation with the occupation in terms of customs, economics, banks, trade is killing factor, and that even Arab states cannot tolerate Islamic government or governance. He said also the combination between resistance and governance is not impossible. And he also talked about the functional division between the movement and the government. And the question here is that would this model work for Hamas, or was there a problem in the implementation of this model? At the end, he said this experience persisted because of popular support in addition to the military force, and so to have a chance of success, Islamic movements have to take those factors into consideration. Thank you so much. Now we move to Dr. Ahmed Yusuf's paper in terms of evaluation from the point of view of the diaspora. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, I hope Rabbi Shrah li Sadri wa Yassir li Amri, may God guide me to say the right thing. First of all, I would like to greatly thank Dr. Sami Al-Arian and SIGA and Sabah al-Din Zaim University for sponsoring such an enormous undertaking in the evaluation of governance experiences in the Arab world or around the world. And this is an important and much needed review in order to build contexts and histories to be understood by future generations, by Islamists, although we have some experiences that were failed and others that were static and others that are still undergoing and experimenting. To talk about this topic, which is the combination of resistance and governance and the outcomes. I will talk about this experience because I lived part of my life in the US and also in some Arab countries after the emergence of the Hamas movement and after the development of its constituency and public support and its regard with also some regimes in the region, in addition to many Islamic movements and parties on the broader level for Islamic presence in Arab or Islamic countries, or even within the Islamic communities in Europe and the US. Then the movement, by my observation during the time I was also in Algeria, and the reflections of the growth of this movement and its capacities, be it in resistance or in charity, through my observations in Algeria and also in Lebanon and some Gulf states, because it was during that time that the capacities of Hamas were manifest in terms of resisting the occupation. But afterwards, I worked as a advisor to Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, and the part of my talk is going to be based on our Arab relations and how we managed to build those relations and where we failed and where we succeeded, and our relations with European countries as well, including many meetings behind the scenes, including with the Americans. All of those are things I'm going to focus upon. And my evaluation of those extensive meetings with the Europeans and their regard and their view of Hamas and where Hamas failed or succeeded in the development of those relations and building some of those relations on solid foundations. And we noticed many statements of support on by some parliaments or some politicians in Europe. So the image of Hamas and its role in governance and politics over the past 16 years, there were different views on where we've been successful and where we've been otherwise. And Dr. Youssef has also pointed out to some of those points, as he was part of the government operation at the time, and also the points of failure and were we actually even equipped already for this experience. Let me say that during our time abroad, Hamas emerged in 1987, and it emanated from the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Palestine, and this movement itself is affiliated with a broader, more extensive movement across the world that includes more than 100 million personnel and members. So when Hamas emerged, it received a lot of compassion and sympathy, particularly by Islamists and different groups and movements that have good relations with existing regimes supported this movement and offered it much assistance and support, which facilitated Hamas's ability to develop and evolve its capacity and build institutions or engage in institutions, making Hamas in sometime after its establishment, it started to develop by the day and to win over much support because it was part of the Islamic movement of the Muslim Brotherhood, and because Palestine was a pivotal cause for the Islamic and Arab world. So each Islamist felt that Palestine had a share and they had to offer something and present something. And Palestinians, particularly those in the West, in America and Europe, were able to, so to speak, Palestinianize the consciousness of each Arab and Muslim or make people, Arabs and Muslims, feel that Palestine has an important status for them. It was this that gave great regard for Hamas by movements and regimes in Turkey, Indonesia, and elsewhere. And this has they have offered many material and immaterial support, allowing Hamas to develop and reach a point where it took the decision to participate in governance in order to protect what it has won.
داخل الشارع لابد أن نتقدم لنحمي هذه المساحة، أي أن نكون جزء من مشروع السلطة، لأنه إذا بقينا نعيش على جانب
if we are to look at the developments that happened after Oslo, we will recognize that there was a problem in an infringement on the presence of Hamas, and it had to engage because the PLO turned out that it was through its coordination, it became a proxy for the occupation and infringed on the national identity, the national project, and stood idly by as with the projects of settlements and elsewhere.
It was also a way of reassuring movement with all
أصبحت حماس موجودة في عمق المشهد الفلسطيني بحضورها الواسع.
With the groups, so including students and other groups, because of the success of the group, because of Hamas movement and the success that it showed in the village and town, municipalities and other municipalities, and that was due to the work of the resistance, which, of course, moving Gaza or moving out of Gaza gave the movement a strong push, and it showed that Hamas is able or capable of winning and succeeding. And of course, there are different viewpoints about the success or the there was controversy about joining this, but that controversy was concluded with the participation, because this participation will give the movement to get involved in the governance and politics and to protect its gains, as well as protecting the resistance from being targeted by Israel or by the Palestinian Authority. Of course, in this field or in this scene, we need to take into consideration that a lot of the leaders have experience and are well versed in the work of politics, diplomatic works, with all its requirements, like the protocol, language, all of these things. Maybe were lacking a lot of the leaders of Hamas, but the willingness and to opinion to go through this experience and to prove that the Islamists have the ability, although it is a resistance movement that will give the Palestinian people their due right in liberation and independence. All of these things were taking place in the minds of everybody who were thinking about getting involved in politics. Well, of course, the entire world, when they have seen that, and first and on top of which were the Palestinian Authority and Israel, that Hamas will won the majority, and this will allow it to make or to form a government with a majority. All of this made the Western world provoked, and the United States worked since the first moment to block the roads and not to give way to Hamas to succeed in its political experience. And unfortunately, there were a lot of other Arab regimes and the states who were not comfortable with the success of Hamas, because this will give Islamists to win in elections in their respective countries. And this, especially that we were facing the policy that was followed by the United States and the West after 9/11, which was under the umbrella of the combating terrorism. Combating terrorism meant fighting Muslims and Islamists in their institutions, and Islamists who are working and functioning or playing different roles in charity or in education or in da'wah. So that it was inevitable for this success or for this experience to fail. Therefore, the United States and unfortunately those who are in line with the United States, whether Arab or Western countries, they were looked forward to foil this experience and not to give it any space to succeed. We have seen in the beginning how a lot of diplomats, ambassadors, and the Western institutions that came to Gaza Strip to meet with the members of the political committee of Hamas and their leadership. Maybe they wanted to find a way to deal with Hamas and to see whether this movement is different from Al-Qaeda or from Taliban, etc., etc. So they rushed and sat down with different levels in the leadership. Some of those countries tried to make acquaintance with the position or to learn the position that Hamas wants to make or to take. With a few exceptions of those who wanted to learn about Hamas, they found that they need to deal with Hamas. I mean, the minority wanted to deal with Hamas. Some of the countries that are not agreeing with putting Hamas on the lists of terrorism, like Norway and Switzerland and other countries that wanted to learn about this experience, but they wanted to meet with some of the leaders of Hamas away from Gaza, and they invited them to Norway, Switzerland, the UK, or in other places behind the scenes. And maybe Mr. Mohammed Al-Madhoun was one of the invitees or one of the delegations that participated in these meetings. I traveled with him to Switzerland, and we talked with the Swiss foreign department, and there were other delegations that were sent in order to learn more about this. For example, France sent a special envoy to learn more about Hamas, its stance towards others. The United Nations also sent the quartet representative, who was always present, and the countries that are related to the quartet as well, to some extent, were present. So the Palestinians issued a document that was called having a truce for 5 years, and everybody was saw that it would be a good sign. But the idea, even if it was welcomed in the West, but there was a pressure against it by Israel and the Palestinian Authority as well. wanted to condemn this document. Italy was sending some delegations, and they had some good viewpoints, and they all wanted to engage rather than isolate. They called on that. They said, let's engage with the movement, let's meet with their leaders, because we can find a way to work which will help in a vision similar to what have been achieved by with the Palestinian Authority in Oslo. The Europeans, unfortunately, who are in line with the or inclined with the U.S. Policy, didn't want to make any any close relations with Hamas. For example, the International Crisis Group and Rosemary and other figures like Robert Dan and other people met with us, and the Americans sent some people that met with us as well. We sent letters to the European Union, about 14 letters we sent them to the European Union. We sent also letters to the US President Barack Obama, and we are introducing our vision, introducing the movement. And even for the quartet, we sent letters that were given to their representative who was inhabitant in Gaza. And we were calling on the Western country and the United States to uphold their values, to give the right to self-determination, for example, to the people, and to deal with the movement, and that we are open to deal with the international community, with international organizations, UN, etc., etc. And we have set, or we have put a lot of things in our letters to justify our policies and our justifications. However, not everything that was issued came in the same language or in the same formulations. Some people went out of context. Maybe there were some statements that were issued, and for some people, they saw that there are balanced statements, but there were other statements that were strong, and they were held a lot of threatening. In addition to which made the Hamas similar to the groups that are designated as terrorist groups. So this showed that there is no clear vision, and we were, or Hamas was relying on the document of 1988, and it managed to create a policy in which the Israel or other unbalanced entities in the West cannot use, for example. So the paper of policy in 2017 had a very balanced language, and it was answering to a lot of the points that or accusations that were made against Hamas, that it is an extremist group. However, this paper didn't have a lot of interaction by foreign countries. I have a comment on the issue of coupling governance and resistance. Maybe this is very difficult in Palestine, because we are living under occupation, or as it is called by some people, after the vision that we have two governments for a people without a homeland. The West, of course, providing a cover for the practices of the Israelis. Israel is not condemned in the international arenas, etc. So we thought that there were a lot of opportunities of success hadn't this division took place, if we all as Palestinians took into consideration the participation and the share taking in the national responsibility. Unfortunately, if after 2007, if we managed to have a reconciliation and end this division and have one voice, maybe we would have diminished these accusations that were made against Hamas, and the world would understand that we are under this situation, we have the right to have our own state and to have independent state, as the United Nations decided in 2011 to add the Palestinian state as a monitoring member, and then to be included as a member state in the United Nations agencies. Unfortunately, of course, I'm not saying that we didn't make mistakes. We have made a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of statements and some practices as well that were wrongful. But we, people or leaders, had a vision, and we wanted to be part of this experience, and they were keen on doing that. But there were a lot of obstacles in their face. The United States also have put a veto in order not to reach any understanding amongst each other as Palestinians between Hamas and Fatah, and to make this project succeed, to end settlement and to give us the right to live. Even if we agree on the state at the borders of 1967, maybe this will protect us and give us a step to take further steps later, or to live under, for example, one state or a two-state solution that will give us an opportunity to maintain our cause, our people, our holy places. But Israel didn't want that, and the Palestinian Authority wasn't keen to unify the people. So all of these obstacles and the lack of enablement showed that we were unable to couple between the resistance and politics, and that was evident, or that is evident, by the hard living conditions in Gaza Strip and the boredom of the grassroots or the constituency in a way or another. And after the Arab Spring, a lot of the regimes that used to support Palestine, their position declined, and we couldn't achieve what we wanted to have, to bridge the gaps with those countries. Although we wanted to have a diplomatic language, a political language, and not to feel that we are in under the arm of anybody or in the pocket of anybody. We wanted to make sure that Palestine is the cause of the entire Ummah, and every single Muslim or Arab person on earth should protect and should work for the Palestinian cause. Unfortunately, the Arab regimes, because they are inclined with the American policy, and they don't want to see Islamists succeed in their experience in governance or politics. So some of those countries normalized relations, some of them opened direct relations, and Hamas started, everything started to narrow down on Hamas, and even the relations that used to be with some countries in the region. Unfortunately, Hamas lost such relations. Ultimately, in terms of the recommendations or the conclusions, a lot of them are in line or identical to what Mr. Yusuf mentioned, and most importantly, to focus on the political participation, national dialogue, and communicate with the Palestinian Authority in a way or another, despite all the pressure that we have to fail any attempt to achieve any of those conclusions or those visions. That's all from my side. Thank you very much, Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, and thank you for SIGA for this pioneer experience to read in the study of the experience of the Palestinian of the Islamic movements in governance and politics. Thank you very much, and peace be upon you. Thank you, Mr. Ahmad, for your presentation. He talked about the analysis or evaluation of the experience from Palestinians in the diaspora. He said that Hamas emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood, so it is part of the international Muslim Brotherhood movement. So it has a lot of members and constituency in the Arab world. And he said that it started its Palestinian action in December 1987. Then he talked why there was engagement with the authority, and they felt that it is dangerous for the party, the Palestinian party that signed on Oslo agreement, to stay alone, and they were successful with the work at the syndicates and the municipalities. Then he talked about a lot of the leadership in Hamas who wanted to or started to get involved in the political work in order to be able or prepared for working in the politics and diplomatic activity. Then he talked about the Arab, the US, and Western attempts to foil this experience under the umbrella of combating terrorism. This war, the war against terrorism, that was targeting the Islamic institutions and movements in general. After the establishment of Hamas, or they started to get into the governance, there were attempts to communicate with Hamas to see whether there were policies that can be accepted by the West, but Israel foiled all of these attempts. Then some Western institutions met with Hamas, and Hamas has tried to explain its viewpoint of about the future and about this conflict. And then there was a document that was issued, but Western countries didn't interact with it. And this question needs to be answered. He said whether we agree on the borders of 1967 or the Palestine entirely from the river or to the sea. I don't know whether this is a position of Hamas or what he meant when he mentioned that. In his paper, there is some details about the challenges that the movement faced after getting into the top of the government in 2007. Then he said that he talked about the regional relations of Hamas in the paper, and he mentioned that in each, or he provides a paragraph about each country, the position towards Syria, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. These are the main countries in the region. Then he talked about the foreign relations with Western countries, how they developed and where they are now. He said that there is a kind of stalemate, especially in terms of the attitudes of the Western countries since they got into government. Also, in his paper, he talked about some challenges that will be faced in the future and that the movement should take into consideration. And towards the end, he said that regardless of the different positions about the success or the lack of success in coupling governance and resistance, Hamas is trying to throw its government to prove that it can couple that. However, unfortunately, the United States, other Western countries, and Arab countries wanted to put obstacles in the face of such success and to maintain the Hamas in a way of incapability, incapacity, suffering, and siege. Of course, to solve this problem, it requires to normalize relations with the Arab countries and then the countries in the region, and not to be and with the Palestinian Authority, and not to be under this division in Palestine. Thank you very much. The third paper will be by Dr. Muhammad Ibrahim Al-Madoun under the title "The Experience of Hamas: The Challenges of Governance in Gaza, the Response and the Consequence." The floor is yours. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most bountiful, all the praise and the prayers and blessings be upon his messenger, upon the messenger of Allah, Muhammad, peace be upon him. First, I would like to salute all of our people inside and outside.
والله احنا نسمع جيدا احمد. انت اخرج وادخل مرة ثانية. تسمعني دكتور احمد؟
نعم اسمعك دكتور.
طيب لو تخرج وتدخل مرة ثانية احنا نسمعه جيدا.
One of the guests is not listening, is not hearing, so he is advised to find a solution to the technical problem he's facing. Okay, please. All participants, mute yourselves, and if you are unable to hear, please log out and then log in again, and the problem should be corrected. So first, I would like to salute all of our Palestinian people in the diaspora or inside Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the territories of 1948, or in Ramallah, or in any other place. And I would like to say that our Palestinian people is still upholding to the promise to liberate their land and to get back to Palestine. And I would like to thank Sabah ad-Din Zaim University and SIGA for this invitation, and to my dear brother, Professor Sami Al-Arian. I would like to thank you in person and to thank the SIGA for this effort and for a lot of issues that are raised by this center, including this series of symposium about studying and analyzing the experience of Islamic movements in governance and politics. This is a very distinguished work, so thank you very much. And maybe you're rewarded by Allah. And I would like to salute the dear brothers and other speakers, Dr. Samir Razak. We haven't seen each other for a long time. And my dear brother, Dr. Abu Ahmed. Also, I miss you and I didn't see you for a long time. And Dr. Wa'il Dirat, I also like to salute him from the West Bank, as well as Dr. Hussam Al-Dajani. Peace be upon you all, and we hope to make use of this meeting to all the people, our Palestinian people and Palestinian cause. First, I would like to start talking about the challenges, because the paper that I am providing, the experience of Hamas, the challenges in Gaza, the obstacles and the consequences, or the response and the consequences. I will start with the challenges, and then I will talk about that. The challenges that faced Hamas governance, if we want to limit to Gaza, and this is the normal thing, we will, because Hamas in the West Bank, there was a coup against the results of the elections in 2007. That coup, unfortunately, succeeded in the West Bank, but it didn't succeed in Gaza, because it has a lot of power on the ground in Gaza. So the challenges that are faced by Hamas in Gaza, first of all, the siege that is imposed and that is ongoing for the past 16 years, and the repeated rounds of aggression by the occupation against Gaza also affected the capability of Hamas to have a stable government. And the government of Hamas was doing a kind of a crisis management, and this crisis management was crystallizing in different forms and shapes, but all of that was working under ongoing siege, and the siege itself took different shapes, and the aggression also was taking place in different periods and different shapes and forms. There was a challenge since the beginning in the face of Hamas as an Islamic movement, or with an Islamic terms of reference. There was a lot of challenges, and to become the leader of the Palestinian people, of course, this was the starting point of a very important challenge that it will face. In addition to being an Islamic resistance movement, it is a resistance movement. So coupling the resistance and the Islamic background, of course, it was a point of a challenge that was risky and threatening to Hamas, because as an international Islamic movement, that is not something that is plausible. The development since 1987 until today, and becoming a very difficult number that cannot be overlooked in the formula. This was also that was a success for Hamas despite all the challenges. When Hamas succeeded in the elections, it didn't abandon the resistance or to make a different program. They didn't abandon the resistance neither in statements nor in practice on the ground, which shows that this is a movement that is a practicing resistance, and at the same time it is in government. Although the challenge that it had in the beginning, as Dr. Yusuf said, that the challenge that it was facing was that when Hamas is going to practice governance, the discussion was that is going to get involved in governance under the ceiling of Oslo Accords. But the elections was one of the Oslo Accords results, but at the same time, it maintained its resistance program, and that was a challenge. And I believe that challenge was obvious and very clear since the beginning of the experience in June 2006, when the Jalad Shalit was captured, and it showed that Hamas cannot be tamed away from resistance. In addition to that, there are the challenges of the international prerequisites that started since the early on. For example, the conditions of the quartet. It puts a lot of challenges that once Hamas, that even the success of Hamas in elections was something that is rejected. And the first prerequisite of Hamas is to participate or to practice the role of opposition in the Legislative Council, and not to be part of the executive authority. And that puts all parties in a problem that it could be acceptable at one level of the taming of Hamas to be part of the Legislative Council, but it's not acceptable at all to be part of the executive authority. And that, since the beginning, put Hamas in face to face with these international prerequisites. And the other challenge was made by Fatah Hamas and other factions. Other factions in the beginning didn't have a peaceful position towards Hamas. Most of the time, they were accusing Hamas in its practice and in its positions, and that created an environment in governance that wasn't stable, nor fair, nor capable of or possible for Hamas to govern in comfort. So Hamas was in governance, but not practicing government. And I believe the dear speakers, other speakers who were part of this experience, they lived this experience firsthand, and they found that there is a deep state that prevented Hamas from government, and this reality didn't make Hamas comfortable in governments. Then the political system that was amended in 2005, or sorry, in 2003, to take the powers that Abu Ammar used to have. And at the time afterwards, Abu Mazen, this created a political system that had a conflict of authority or functions.
Was conflictual from within between the PLO and the government. So the government, which was the executive branch, became a bit problematic. So this combination between the political and the executive was problematic. When Fatah was in power, Abu Ammar was present as a president, and Abu Mazen was the head of the government, and it was conflictual. There was a disagreement between them. And if you go back to the address of Abu Mazen at the time, you would believe that it was written by Ismail Haniyeh. So this confliction in the political system or governance system was already present, with two heads, the presidency represented by Abu Fatah and the government headed by Hamas. So if as Prime Minister and President from Fatah they did not agree, how can you imagine how much disagreement there would be if there are two conflicting or different parties in charge. The official Arab stance was also another major challenge to the governance, and Hamas is still experiencing a boycott that increases or decreases in proportionate to the situation. Over 15 years of governance, of Hamas's governance, there were different waves of an increase or decrease of this boycott. But throughout, it was precarious situation and one that is constantly changing and unstable. As Dr. Youssef Rizqa mentioned, there were some phases before June or July 2007 and the end of, the establishment of the government by the end of March in 2006 and then June 2007, and then until the 2008 Al-Furqan battle, it was another milestone, and until 2010 we had another milestone, and with 2011 to 2013 and 14 it was a new milestone with the Arab Spring, and in those times we had different forms of governance, but we did not have the necessary stability. And the form of governance was very much varied and required pragmatism by Hamas in addressing this issue, in dealing with those Arab stances. But Hamas was good in interacting with popular and grassroots stances, which were capital for an asset for Gaza, and ended up with convoys and aid, particularly in 2012, and made Gaza very much present in the Arab and Islamic world, in addition to internationally. Of course, there was another challenge related to the increasing humanitarian needs, as Gaza is in a siege, not in a picnic, under siege and not in a picnic, which created an exacerbation of crisis. Generations of graduates, tight siege, not allowing remittances, not allowing commodities. All of this created an increasing humanitarian need. And how can Hamas answer to those increasing humanitarian needs while they were struggling for the basic needs of life? In my understanding, the most important strengths can be summarized in 3 points. First, the strong organizational structure was important and played a great role in Hamas's ability to be steadfast. It was in a battle of steadfastness rather than prevalence, and this is quite challenging, and you need to maintain the support of the community. And Hamas, to evaluate its governance experience is unfair because it did not get the appropriate chance to govern, but its steadfastness and perseverance in governance is in itself an achievement. Hence, the organizational structure of Hamas constituted an important factor that played into the ability of Hamas to persevere. When we had those sit-ins by the teachers, doctors, employees, it became a government like a head without a body, or at that point Hamas brought volunteers from its own ranks and tried to fill the void quite quickly. Hence, the organizational structure was an important factor of success. The other point was the public constituency or public support. It was clear that the counting on the Palestinian community was successful, and all the operations on Gaza and all the battles, all of those milestones have confirmed that the public constituency and public support, despite the dear price being paid, was present, and despite the failures or the few failures or weaknesses in the relation with the constituency or the public support that needed to be addressed and acknowledged, but Hamas tried to address them by a number of campaigns by which it tried to maintain its constituency and public support, and it started a department concerned with its constituency and to poll and probe into the public mood in order to better address their needs and to address the needs of the Palestinian people who have been victims of many aggressions. And this is present in the consciousness of the Palestinian people as well as in the eyes of the Israelis as well. The third point of strength, which is a main strength, which is the military and security force. Hamas, through governance, was able to accumulate more military power, so much so that it has been able to put Gaza Strip, which is small, besieged, open as a territory to the occupation, and it puts eye to eye to the occupation that is far more equipped and armed. And this is something that is a strength for Hamas in governance and in maintaining the resistance as a project, with the banner, a hand that builds and a hand that resists. So they maintain this combination, and this reasserts that Hamas's position in power has supported it as a resistance movement to the stage where we are today as well. And also Al-Qassam as a security body has confirmed the military operation, and this military force has added a lot to Hamas's ability to establish and achieve success. If we are to establish or present the experience of Hamas in governance, we're talking about three authorities or branches. We have the monitoring and the legislative authority, because the legislative council is supposed to be a monitor or observer, the judiciary as well as the executive. The authorities have been playing an important role, particularly the legislative authority have played a role in supporting the resistance movement. Many of the laws issued by the legislative body were not in line with the Oslo Accord and provided the legal framework for the support of resistance, including the law of resistance, the law of return, and the law of the refugee, etc. And also, to some extent, they played their observer or monitoring role through opening up to the community and through the Department of Administrative and Financial Monitoring and Grievances Department. They tried to correct and rectify the procedures one way or another in the executive branch. But of course, the presence of the power in the hand of one party, which is Hamas, may have its restrictions, but the legislative authority has played an important role nonetheless. And despite the unjust decision and the illegal decision to dissolve the Legislative Council, and despite the cancellation of elections last year, Hamas, through the opinion polls, and they all confirmed that Hamas's ability to get to the forefront of legislative authority were quite prominent. The judiciary has become almost void. Most judges left their positions by instructions from Ramallah, and this was a major challenge. How can you build the judiciary, the justice department, and the law department with this financial extortion and attrition, and with this major challenge? The number of people working now in the judiciary is larger than before, and the procedures of litigation are accelerated now than before, and the role of the judiciary has been resumed. Before Hamas, at some point, people would no longer refer to the judiciary. They would go to tribal arbitration or other forms of litigation or arbitration because they lacked the trust and confidence in the judiciary. But after Hamas's governance and rule, the judiciary has regained its regard and its role, relatively speaking, of course. If we are to talk about the different aspects of the judiciary, we have to point out also the development of tribal courts in addition, or judiciary, and the Sharia judiciary, which has become more stable, although some of them were informal, but they have developed their performance quite significantly, and with a community involvement and participation in the judiciary, which is important in playing a role in mitigating or in decreasing the need for formal judiciary and formal litigation. Dr. Ibrahim, you have 3 minutes. Dr. Muhammad, عفوا. I will be brief, inshallah. In terms of the executive branch, at the level of the security, if we are talking about different sectors, we have the security, which has offered an important model in governance. Okay, we lost the speaker for a minute. So the internal front is so much under control security-wise, even at the level of liberties and freedoms. To a large extent, if we compare between the West Bank and Gaza, we would see that freedoms in Gaza are more available, and Hamas, particularly at later stages, was not practicing, but because today we have litigation and the judiciary, so there is no crushing of freedoms, and the control of internal security goes through the judiciary and other civil mechanisms. We lost the speaker. Oops. Can you hear me? No, your voice is intermittent. We can hear you now. You have 2 minutes only. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, please go ahead. At the level of security, we can say, as I said, at the level of infrastructure, which is one of the important sectors in governance, the infrastructure can be said, it can be said that Gaza before Hamas is totally different from Gaza after Hamas. A visitor, even those who had left Gaza during the 2007 conflict. When they came back to Gaza, they said and they witnessed the transformation that Gaza has witnessed in terms of roads, hospitals, schools, etc. And when we talk about community service and service provision, I believe Dr. Hussam knows this much better and would involve this in his presentation. But in economic terms, there is a lot to talk about, particularly that we're talking about governance under siege and the forms of governance and the forms of siege, that is imposed on this governance and its impact on the service provision sectors. However, those have been stabilized and have even sometimes developed, particularly the health sector. For example, the open heart surgeries, the eye surgeries have been developed, as for also the stability in terms of education, etc. You wouldn't feel that you are in a besieged area and not a state altogether, but it is under siege. But we have a continuous and stable education, the health clinics, etc. They have even developed to a great degree. We have a new a hospital for tumors, the Kuwaiti, Turkish, and Emirati hospitals. I don't want to go into many details, but I would like to say that the services are improving. As for media and cultural development and intellectual development, actually, Gaza has its voice heard strongly, politically and media-wise. It actually represents the backbone of the Palestinian cause. If Gaza moves, the different aspects of the Palestinian cause would move and respond. In Saif al-Quds operation, of the Sword of Jerusalem operation, it was very clear. If we are to talk about the political framework in terms of this experience, of course, the different stages, the variance and the instability affected its performance. Hamas was not in power, but in government, and the combination between resistance and governance was a challenge. And also the Palestinian political system and its own problems constitute a problem themselves, let alone the conflict between that and the Hamas's performance in politics and governance. As for talking about a partnership or monopoly with Hamas, there was a lot of talk that Hamas monopolized power, but if you monitor this closely, Hamas calls for coalition government, and all the parties in the PLO are closer to Hamas than they are to Fatah, and it is no longer a question whether Hamas is monopolizing or is unitary in its approach, unilateral in its approach. So to speak about Hamas refraining from partnership, I believe this is something that we have put behind us to a great extent. And now when we talk about who cancelled the elections, who rejects working in a broad national front, etc., this is something that has become very well known. So the language of division is no longer relevant. We're not talking about a division here, but we are talking about hijacking Palestinian decision-making and Palestinian responsibility very clearly. So this is something that needs to be discussed. And also to talk about opening openness or introversion in terms or closeness in terms of external or foreign relations. This is something that many accuse Hamas of being not open to everybody. On the contrary, Hamas has been very open and very welcoming. On the contrary, because it was too open to conflicting sides, it played the role of a mediator. So in addition to the idea of partnership, it did not practice isolation. They wanted to isolate it, but Hamas did not give in to this isolation. On the contrary, it worked on two levels, the national political diplomacy as well as the community diplomacy. Of course, their achievement is not full-fledged, and it is necessary for Hamas to open up even further and make further efforts. Finally, really, one minute. The prospects. It's clear that Hamas now is far from having no choice. On the contrary, it's the Oslo track that has come to a dead end, and this is an important outcome of the Hamas governance. The other thing is to the formation of a broad national front, and Hamas needs to help form this front and engage it in governance. The method, the elections, etc., are details to be discussed. The other issue is putting an end to the siege in Gaza. The return marches have contributed to a mitigation of the siege and an opening of the Rafah checkpoint, border crossing. But this is important. However, what is necessary is a complete removal and lifting of the siege and to launch and inaugurate the seaport in Gaza. Also, at the level of resistance program, it is important for this program to accelerate, and it is clear that everywhere in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza have this resistance agenda on the rise, and it's important to know that all the components of the Palestinian people want to resist, and it is also to formally declare Oslo dead, because it died and it has not been buried yet, but it needs to be formally declared null and void, because it is important also to consider the repercussions of the continuance of the status quo under the Oslo Accord. But politically, Hamas's experience has to end up in the declaration of the nullification of the Oslo Accord and the agreement on a single national program pointing and oriented to Jerusalem, as it is clear as the main target of our national agenda, and also to disclose and unveil the brutality of the occupation. And it has become very clear how desperate and shameful the occupation is with the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh. So it is important to unveil this brutality and to link the grievances here with grievances elsewhere, and also to develop international relations with new states, including in Latin America, many of which are in support of the Palestinian cause, and also to make better governmental performance and to better separate powers and prevent any overlap between Hamas as an organization and governmental work as a service-providing agency, and also to work on other sectors that are auxiliary to governance and supporting to governance. And this calls for new priorities in the state and society. I hope I have been able to contribute to this qualitative symposium.
المقاطعة لأن الوقت يعني يمر بسرعة.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because we have a lack of, we are at the nick of time, but it is a very precious paper, and we will have all of them will be published in a book that will include all of the recommendations. In the beginning, he talked about the challenges that the movement is facing, and he mentioned so many of them, including the ongoing siege that has for 16 years and the different repeated military operations that led to lack of stability and the different crises, and then the challenge of the movement as an Islamic movement or a movement with an Islamic background and a resistance movement. And these two elements together create a challenge, not only for in the face of the international community, but in the region itself. And he said also that one of the challenges at one of the levels that this was under this government was under Oslo, and at the same time it was also a resistance movement, and that was a challenge whether it will uphold Oslo Accords or it will continue resistance, and that wasn't an easy task to do. He also said that there was no environment that allows Hamas to govern in light of all of these challenges. And he said that there are challenges that has to do with the government in Palestine, even when Fatah was alone in the governments, and there was a difference between Abu Ammar and Abu Mazen. It was an authority with two heads as the president and the prime minister. So how would the case be with an ideological movement at the strategic level? He also said that there is a challenge at the formal Arab position, and especially in terms of having an Islamic movement in governance, and that there was a lack of stability that didn't allow the movement to be stable in governance. And it was working in the mode of crisis management most of the time, in addition to the lack of remittances or the flow of money or work. And then he talked about the strengths, and the main strengths of Hamas, the first of which was the strength of its structure, and this is a success by itself. Then he talked about the constituency, and that those who thought that the constituency will leave Gaza, actually they grouped around the movement. And he talked about the military and security successes and how it managed to be a deterrent force against the occupation. And then he talked about the challenge through some achievements and some failures. He talked about the legislative authority, the judicial authority, and the executive authority, and the infrastructure and the media, cultural and educational work. In brief, he said that Hamas wasn't in governance, but it was in the government. And he said that because it insisted on the coupling between resistance and government, it faced a lot of problems, and there were a lot of problems that it dealt with. The first one, the dichotomy of the ruling alone, and then he talked about the repercussions, and that Hamas has options, and it should establish a wide backgrounds or framework for governance, and that it should or the program of the resistance should increase in the bank and in the other areas, and to eliminate Oslo Accords altogether, and to work together with the Palestinians to uncover the practices of the occupation, and to move forward to the liberation, and to improve the government work in different sectors. He provided 11 recommendations in his paper, but there was no time to present them all in details. But this was most of what he mentioned in his paper. I would like to thank Dr. Ibrahim, and now we will move to the fourth paper, which is the paper of Dr. Raed Bayrat, and it talks about the dichotomy of resistance and politics and the challenges in governance. The floor is yours. We can't hear the speaker.
صوت دكتور أعتقد لا نسمعك. إذا ممكن unmute تفتح الصوت. تمام.
نعم شكرا أستاذ سامي. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami, and I would like to thank SIGA for this invitation and the effort that you are exerting, and my thanks to Sabah Din Zaim University. I would like also to thank all the speakers and attendees. Indeed, I find myself in a very critical position because those who spoke before me were engaged in the political work. So here, I will present, allow me to call it the academic approach of the topic of Hamas movement and the dichotomy of resistance and politics and the challenges or the question of governance. Many of the points that of the points in my paper have been talked about, and I agree with many of the points that were mentioned by the speakers who spoke before me, the distinguished speakers. But I will try in my paper to present a scientific or an academic approach that depends on the critical description. My paper is about and the dialectics of this. So I'm in my paper I am talking about the macro level and not at the micro level. And in my paper, the approach of my paper is the explanation based on talking on the fact that talking about the successes and failures is not only about the self-success or self-failure, but we need to put that in the entire package of the public dynamics and how to explain it in according to the reality that is lived. So my paper is based on realism and not on idealism. I will start my approach by presenting a question that is raised usually, that Hamas managed to couple resistance and governance in a oversimplified way, as if there was a possibility to have good governance and a resisting regime. And I believe this is not correct. If we want to talk about good governance, so I believe we cannot couple between good governance and resistance in the Palestinian reality. The question of good governance by itself in the Palestinian reality as an authority under the physical occupation in the West Bank, or the metaphysical occupation as the case in Gaza Strip. Also, I believe that this is not correct as well. And I believe that this is something that is agreed upon by most of the monitors and researchers who monitor closely the situation in Palestine, the political situation in Palestine. Now, maybe the logical question would be, to what extent Hamas managed to maintain its resisting nature? Maybe this is the central question. And what are the successes that were made by Hamas in employing both sides to serve each other. To what extent Hamas managed to employ government to serve the resistance and to employ resistance to serve governance. Maybe this should be the central question. Added to it, the macro question or the the overall question, which is what are the national achievements that are made by Hamas through being in governance and leading the resistance in a way or another. Here, it is very important to take into consideration the trilogy of the relation or the dynamics that are in these issues, which is the peculiarity of the Palestinian resistance, the peculiarity of the Palestinian environment, and the peculiarity of the Palestinian governance, especially under Hamas. Why under Hamas? For a very important reason. Hamas came to the national Palestinian Authority in its weakest forms. There are two forms when Hamas came to power. The first one was the weakness of the international tendency towards the Palestinian cause and the two-state solution. Some people were talking about the decline of the two-state solution and the new Israeli tendency toward Oslo Accords. And this weakened the quality weight of the Palestinian cause. And the second one was when in a general decline of the structures of government in Palestine, the economic condition after the Al-Aqsa Intifada, weakness in the legislation, a network of clients and relations that were completely destroyed. So here was the idea of bringing Hamas, which will serve in restoring the strength of the Palestinian Authority. And the main issue here, basically, the vision of President George W. Bush, which was based on the idea of democratization of the institution. And that was one of the reasons that allowed Hamas to get into the institutions and to elect a leadership that doesn't support or promote terrorism. And that was the question or the dilemma, because by the Hamas was designated as a terrorist group by the Americans. So here it's as if you are against the entire context. Now, you want to have a leadership that doesn't promote terrorism, but you bring someone that is designated as a terrorist, active terrorist group. So the philosophy of the presence of Hamas wasn't based on the question of who is Hamas within the authority, but it was rather under the rule of responding to the necessities imposed by the reality. This reality, with its implications, was imposing on the political players the attempt to employ that and find a way that doesn't allow Hamas to make use of this reality that was imposed upon the political players. That's why we have seen the internal, the domestic and the foreign sanctions and the obstacles that didn't give Hamas the opportunity to overcome them. On the contrary, these obstacles were a kind of a flow of these obstacles, and the more Hamas would try to untie one of these obstacles, things will become more complicated to it. The other peculiarity, which is the peculiarity of the resistance, and here we may get into the academic philosophy, the problem of accepting the idea that is accepted by the politicians of Hamas. The literature of Hamas and its political statements and its theoretical theorizers puts the academic monitors in front of a problem, which is as if Hamas does not appreciate itself. I mean, Hamas is not a normal resistance movement. In order to make a breakthrough in the political vision towards it by countries that are against Hamas. On the contrary, Hamas until today presents itself as or it presents itself that it rejects the existence of Israel altogether. And here we will have a question: how the world that supports this Zionist entity will accept Hamas or deals with Hamas? Here I'm not saying, academically speaking, that Hamas should present itself in a different way. What I'm saying here is that the level of clarity in presenting this vision is very important today. To whom? To the different intersections, in order to understand the political action of Hamas, whether in governance or in its relations. The third point is the regional environment and the international environment. And here it is clear that there is lack of clarity. I mean, the modern world, the legitimacy of the political actor comes through two aspects, either by the recognition of the international community or through the legitimacy of alliances. And here we see, or we find, that Hamas is not part of an alliance, and Hamas does not have the capability or the possibility to gain an international recognition. Thus, the issue of governance within Hamas becomes, especially in the first phase, after the legislative elections, it is a question of implementation and the legitimacy of existence. And here, it was very important to have a clear relationship and build on that. I mean, when we speak about the resisting movement of Hamas, then Hamas is required to respond to fixing the values that put the resistance in the general Palestinian community. And these values can be summarized in 5 key values. The first value is the national partnership, and that was not present in most of Hamas's experience. For sure, I'm not saying I'm not blaming Hamas for all of the obstacles because of not making any partnership. However, it is very important to have this value on the top of other values, because this is the one that serves the Palestinian resistance, and this is the one that serves the mentality of Hamas at the long run. The second issue is strengthening the institutions and the absence of nepotism on those institutions. This too was a problematic point after the winning of the elections by Hamas and establishing the government alone. There is another point, which is strengthening the steadfastness of the Palestinian citizen. And here we have a very important point in the evaluation. Usually we have a triangle of relations: strong authority and a weak community, a strong community and a strong authority, strong community and a weak government. Actually, since Hamas came to power in Palestine, and we are seeing a weak authority, and this authority is diminishing as well. However, the results after Hamas came to power, I mean, before Hamas came to power, we had a strong community or a strong society, a society that has its own culture, its own institutions at all levels. However, after Hamas came to power, we started to see a weak society, especially after Hamas controlled the power in Gaza Strip. The society in its popular institutions and the people who are not organized became weaker. And this is a huge challenge that resulted from having Hamas in authority or in governance. The second issue after having Hamas in governance, which came after Hamas took control over Gaza Strip, this created new formulas and new challenges that were faced by Hamas movements. And sometimes we hear some discourse that responds to or that is in line with these challenges. Some of those challenges, in addition to what my colleagues mentioned, so many of the points that were mentioned, I'm not going to repeat them because I agree with what has been said. So the problem here was the strategy of linking Hamas to Gaza Strip. And this was a dangerous thing at different levels. The first level was that the Gaza Strip, with all of its problems, started to to cast its shadow on Hamas and its resistance. The second problem was as if resistance is limited to Gaza Strip. And the third problem was about the elitist nature of the resistance. So Hamas, it is true that Hamas was creative in creating a resisting power that could face the occupation. But this by itself made resistance a very high elitist resistance, and this resistance, what is required from this resistance is to lead the other geography or other territories in Palestine. We have seen that tangibly. Even though in past Ramadan, we have seen a big breakthrough that was in Hamas's interest, but it wasn't a macro breakthrough, because this breakthrough, if it didn't develop, it will remain as an obstacle in the face of the Palestinian resistance. Additionally, even when Hamas ruled Gaza, it couldn't produce a participatory governance. Although there are alliances and there are some participatory approach on the ground. However, until today, we cannot say that there is a kind of partnership that we can be proud of or presented as a model for governance. The other point that is still an obstacle in the face of Hamas was the democracy of institutions. I mean, since Hamas took control over governance in Gaza until today, there were no elections in the institutions. The municipalities or universities. And of course, this raises question marks. I believe today Hamas is facing, at the level of governance and resistance, it faces 4 challenges. The first is the return of Hamas to the West Bank. I mean, the return of Hamas to West Bank, not with its resisting spirit, but rather with the, at the minimum, the institutional and communal presence. This is not a present. The second challenge that faces Hamas today, the ability of Hamas to lead the period politically, not in terms of resistance. Today, there are plenty of bodies and figures that look scattered around, and all of those figures need a body to lead them. Therefore, Hamas might be demanded to produce a body that can accommodate all of those figures that are scattered around the globe. The third challenge, or the third point, is the flexibility of Hamas movement. Hamas movement as an ideological movement suffers the same thing that other ideological groups suffer from, such as it is not fit enough to respond to the quick or the swift challenges. Hamas is one of the most, one of the groups that need this flexibility the most because of the swift changes that happen to the Palestinian cause. What we see is that Hamas movement until today, despite or although they adopted the policy paper of 2017, they are repeating themselves. And even when there was some talk about the elections of 2011, the observers didn't see any improvement in the performance and the modus operandi of Hamas movement. It's not different at all from the change and reform movement with its figures and performance. And I believe this by itself need to be revisited. The fourth challenge and the last one the national approach of Hamas towards political partnership and the relation with the region and the creation of alliances. I believe this requires an approach that is capable of being part of the Palestinian reality, because whether we like it or not, Hamas will remain engaged or involved in the governance of Gaza Strip, because this is part of the Arab strategy, Palestinian strategy, and the international strategy, because this shape or this form of relation is comfortable to a lot of parties or to so many parties. Now, all the approaches that were presented up till now, they didn't manage to make any breakthrough or any hole in the wall, resisting wall, whether internal Palestine or internationally or regionally. So they need to make an approach that can lead to achievement in terms of the national participation or national partnership. This approach may not be ideal. A lot of the cries that were made after the announcing the legislative elections and the Palestinian bodies that appeared, why there was no creation of a national front out of these bodies, instead of waiting and not affecting changes. This, in brief, was what I wanted to say in my paper. Added to it, the ideas and comments that I believe I agree with them completely. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لك دكتور رائد.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raed. Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you.
شكرا جزيلا لك. عندي مشكلة في الكمبيوتر.
Thank you so much. It looks like I have a problem with my computer. I will resume my photo a little later. Dr. Raed talked about the dilemma of resistance and politics in Hamas's presence in governance and asked a main question at the beginning: to what extent was Hamas successful in combining good governance with resistance? And he believes that this evaluation constitutes a problem in itself, or it has an essential problematic issue. So the recommendation would be general but require more details. So he suggested that the essential question be to what extent Hamas was able to maintain its principles in the peculiarity of governance in Palestine. So he posed the question: to what extent have those tracks, he talked about the Palestinian cause and Hamas in particular, and to what extent can Hamas make use of those opportunities? Then he said that undoubtedly since the beginning of the PLO, its philosophy and the Oslo Accord, it was a complete opposite of Hamas movement. Hence, dealing with PLO was a matter of dealing with a de facto situation. And he said that the second legislative elections in 2006 allowed for Hamas to participate in within a notion and a framework that did not previously allow for Hamas to participate in power or in the legislative power. For example, in George Bush's administration in 2006, he said that after the Palestinian uprising, there needed to be some reconstruction, and some also looked at Hamas as being distracted by taking power, and there was an expectation that it would not actually seize power and win the election in the first place. As for Hamas, its political conduct and behavior and most of the statements of its leaders were based on the Palestinian common sentiment of being partners and in resistance and in responsibility. But the only accomplishment that could have been made was to argue with the legitimacy. So his analysis was threefold. First of all, was the nature of the Palestinian Authority after the legislative elections. The PLO was already restrained by its agreements with the occupation and its confiscation in terms of its ability and its economy and other tools. And also it tried to resume its symbolic character after it fell during the uprising. The second question on Hamas and resistance, he asked the question was, or could Hamas have employed governance for resistance? And it's known that the elections, the legislative elections, came before the executive elections, and it was clear that with the new president that their solution, the only solution, was peaceful. And how can Hamas engage with him? This is his program, and he enjoys Arab and international support. The third question, what he said was important in terms of the nature of the geography, in terms of relations with Egypt and other neighbors, and also with donors and the international community. This environment did not allow Hamas to persist and engage in this. So to talk about combining resistance and governance under these parameters is far from accurate, and we cannot ignore that Hamas has formed a government as though it had a full-fledged governance system, although rationality would the rational approach would have been to make the use of its winning the election to create a public constituency for resistance. Then he talked about 5 values. The first was political partnership. The second is to decrease favoritism and to support institutionalization. The third was democracy and freedoms and social justice. The fourth is to enhance steadfastness of Palestinians by establishing a resistance economy instead of a consumer economy, and then also to establish institutions. And he said that moving from the society to power has weakened the society. And then we had both a weak authority and a weak community when Hamas moved from one position to the other. On another level, he said, after taking power, when Hamas, that is, took control of Gaza Strip and let go of the control of the PLO, this was a decisive moment, and the pivotal question about the ability to combine those, the resistance and good governance, was Hamas able to offer a model of good governance? He mentioned 3 problems. Basically, the first was the internal Palestinian attitude or position by PLO and other factions, as they considered Hamas's move as a coup. So it was a milestone in an internal conflict in Palestine, while the other factions rejected that division because they didn't want to support one side against the other. Also, the Arab states did not support Hamas in this conflict, and most of them stood against this step and supported the PLO, and this had its repercussions, including a transformation or a shift in the general attitude or position in an environment where war was launched on Islamists in the Arab world, and also the classification of Hamas Hamas as a terrorist group or movement, and the third was the international position, which was in harmony with Arab and Israeli positions, so they tightened the siege on Gaza. And he mentioned that resistance became, in the minds of many, was reduced to Gaza Strip and rather elitist. Then his question about Hamas and governance led him to a number of findings. He said that Hamas was unable to establish participatory governance in Gaza, and it still monopolizes power there. And the second point is that it did not establish democratic institutions. It has offered and established some unions and committees here and there in universities and elsewhere, particularly in different places, not only in Gaza. And the third question about public freedoms, it is up to question still in Gaza Strip, but on the other hand, he mentioned 5 accomplishments that cannot be denied or ignored for Hamas. First of all, Hamas did not establish a religious emirate, but a civil governance. The second is that Hamas was able to establish field and on-the-ground alliances of resistance. And the third was to maintain resistance separately from governance, and it was able to engage in wars without causing chaos in the Strip, and also it was able to get out of the restrictions of Gaza Strip and was able to become the symbol of resistance and resistance movement of the whole of the Palestinian people. I thank all of our speakers. I now move to Dr. Hussam Ad-Dojani to offer his comment while I fix my computer problem. Thank you so much for those valuable papers. I also would like to thank the Center of Islam and Global Affairs in Sabah ad-Din Zaim University in Istanbul. Actually, the papers are extremely valuable, and when they complement one another, and they would become an important overview of this important experience in the history of the Palestinian people, even in the history of Islamic movements in power. When we discuss the experience of Hamas in governance, it's important to focus on 2 main issues, some of which were hinted at by some of the speakers, but not mentioned explicitly. First of all, the idea of the combination between resistance and governance. Governance in Palestine cannot be studied within any academic and analytical methods like anywhere else in the world, like Egypt or Tunisia. Islamists in Palestine have a peculiarity, that sets it apart from the whole world, which is that it is under occupation. And when we say resistance, its definition is the use of all tools and instruments for national liberation and return, which is the definition of the national project in Palestine. And when we talk about governance, governance under Oslo was governance under occupation, and it was a challenge for any government that believes and follows those accords to make those accords or agreements reach to the point of the establishment of a state along the borders of 1967. So Hamas now practices governance without recognizing the Oslo Accord, although this governance was under Oslo Accord. So yes, it is in governance, but it is not a government. So to evaluate or hold Hamas to account in this political context would be unfair because of the peculiar situation in Palestine. If we talk about the challenges, there are 4 main challenges for governance by Hamas. External challenges based on 2 issues, mainly, which need discussion. The first is that Hamas in the international or the American view, it is a terrorist group, and also as viewed by the European Union, Canada, and other powers in the world. So this is the main problem and the challenge for Hamas. When we meet ambassadors from the European Union, would people meet you as a governmental official or as an academic? They refuse the former and accept the latter. And also the other thing is that they are considered an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is confusing for all of the states that consider Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group. And even before the classification of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group, there was suspicion about the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas paid for as well as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, even after its charter in 2017. And although it defined itself as an Islamic or as a national movement with an Islamic point of reference and never mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, it was never pardoned from being affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is an important issue related to the discourse of the political discourse of Hamas. The charter speaks about the conflict with Zionism, while Sinwar mentions Jewish synagogues, which is a discrepancy in discourse that may be paid for by Hamas later. And Hamas has taken power from Fatah, and as Dr. Raed mentioned, Fatah has not adapted itself to a mode of governance by which we had a president and a prime minister from Fatah, from Abu Mazen and Abu Ammar, and with the Mitchell report and other milestones, there was a conflict even within Fatah itself. And also Israel cannot be disregarded as a main player in this, when a movement that is resisting it and fighting it, and even if they accept a state on the borders of 1967, this is not acceptable for Israel, nor is it acceptable internationally. So this is another challenge. There is another organizational challenge, to go back to one of the speakers as well. If we look at the number of specializations in political science in the reform bloc, we find less than 3 or 4. Most people involved have education or Sharia or jurisprudence degrees, and so they lack qualified personnel and statesmanship, and this was clear, and they might have improved with the passage of time. Also, when we talk about, for example, before we go to what Dr. Ahmad mentioned, there are 3 circles within which Hamas's experience can be evaluated to be more fair. The first is human or material resources management for good governance. If we look at its governance in the Gaza Strip, have Hamas appropriately managed material and human resources? This is something I would have hoped to see in the papers of our colleagues, particularly Dr. Muhammad al-Madoud, who has been part of the government and the employment department, and to see the inflation in the number of employees. We find that there are around 50,000 employees, while the need in Gaza Strip is no more than 30,000. Also, the civil or civic culture, and has Hamas helped instill this culture? I might disagree with Dr. Raed when we refer to an article by the bar of lawyers in which involved Mr. Walid Al-Awad within the committee that monitored the students' union and other students' council elections, there was a rejection of this participation. So it wasn't all the fault of Hamas, but there are periodic and regular elections for the bar, for the union of pharmacists, the union, the syndicate of engineers, etc. In 2021, Hamas refused to engage in parliamentary or in other elections in 2021, and that was a mistake. And I agree with you that Hamas will not and has not changed in terms of its political fitness or political obesity, so to speak, that they are quite heavy and did not think a lot in terms of accommodating national leaders that represent a broader national consensus. So when you talk about the organizational structure as one of the strengths of Hamas, I beg to differ, and I hope you can prove this superiority on organizational structure. I believe Hamas has maintained its old structure for a long time to lead a national project, and we find that the leader in Hamas has 10 files to follow up on and may succeed in only 5. So I believe the organizational structure of Hamas should accommodate for more youth leaders, particularly in smaller or minor issues and files to be followed up, which would prove probably a major success. Also, and I'm referring here to my notes, Dr. Ahmad mentioned something very important related to the quartet in his paper, and I am a researcher in Hamas's affairs. I have never heard of this, so this is an important addition, but there is a due clarification. What was the answer of the quartet? And the other question, did the Hamas, by accepting the state at the borders of 1967 or with its capital as Palestine, or the historical Palestine with its capital as Jerusalem? These are very important clarifications to make. To conclude on this point, Dr. Ahmad may have talked about the challenges for the government internally or externally, but has not offered an overview of how Hamas dealt with those phases and those challenges. I believe that Hamas, if we are to hold it to account for its governance experience in Gaza, it should be proud for creating this public support for resistance, and it is this public support of resistance might have created a paradigm shift in our understanding of opinion, of public opinion, despite the unemployment and the poverty, when the citizens, on the other hand, saw that there is a preparedness for resistance by offering security, protection of the internal front. We have this public support, but the concern of Dr. Raed, I completely agree with that. The resistance should not be exclusive to Gaza, nor should missiles be considered the sole form of resistance, and resistance have to become a general status and a general mode of action across Palestinian territories. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hussam, for your comments. Now, at the end of this morning session, I will give the chance for each of our speakers to make any additions or comments. Each speaker will have 5 minutes. We start with Dr. Yusuf Rizqa.
So,
Dr. Yusuf, your mic is muted. Can you unmute your microphone, please?
دكتور يوسف لو تفتح الصوت لو تكرمت.
الو.
ايوه لو تفتح الصوت تفضل.
Yes, please go ahead. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, I would like to thank all the brothers and the speakers. I am quite impressed with what they have presented, and this has been quite useful and multifaceted and came from multiple perspectives. I don't have many comments in this regard, but I would like to clarify one point which Dr. Sami has asked about, which is about liberation first and power or authority then. How would this equation work when I criticized Oslo for giving authority before liberation? It was putting the cart before the horse, and it is the opposite that is required. What is required is to liberate before establishing a state or an authority. And also in terms of the functional division of power between Hamas and the government, it can happen in any experience of governance in Palestine or elsewhere in similar conditions, but with certain restrictions or clear and strict parameters that would prevent an incursion or an infringement on the civil governance by the resistance and refraining from making resistance manage people's affairs. Of course, this combination between the resistance and governance, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that you might find this a dilemma in Palestine. But if we look more in depth at the mode of governance in stable states, we find that governments or our states have an army and a government, and sometimes those states engage in making weapons or in engaging in wars, so they do both governance and resistance or war. And sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. That's not too far from what we have mentioned. And another issue related to the prospects, maybe one of the most important prospects that needs to be considered by analysts and policymakers is how to make the Palestinians engage in an alternative in the case of the failure of negotiations, the two-state solution, and the decline in international support and the rise of Arab normalization of Israel, and also the stance of Palestine towards the international conflict and the parties thereof that has had its toll on Palestine and elsewhere in the Arab world, and the war in Ukraine, for example, and the international division and fissure around it is a challenge. Where does Palestine stand from this, and how can the Palestinian decision employ this international issue for its own ends and for liberation and the establishment of the Palestinian state? I believe that some of the issues related to the organizational structure in Hamas are rightful, but others need to be more fine-tuned. I believe the final comment I have to make here is that in the process of change as a political idea or an idea that is rooted in the lives of the prophets from Adam to Muhammad, peace be upon him, the idea of change. Usually, those who take up change are not subservient to national or external environment, but they often confronted until they achieve the aspired outcome. But some political analysts sometimes think there is it is impossible to create change, and those who want to change have to adapt to the international community, and they try to apply this to Hamas, which considers itself, like other Islamic experiences, a change movement. In other words, it's not part of the existing environment, otherwise it loses its raison d'etre. So it is a movement for change. So we need to be more moderate and fair in approaching this side of evaluation. Finally, I thank you. I thank Siga, Dr. Sami, and all the distinguished speakers who provided us with valuable knowledge in their valuable papers, and I hope we will have the chance to receive a copy of the book issued after this symposium to read and further contemplate the papers of the speakers. Thank you so much, Dr. Youssef. Now the floor goes to Dr. Ahmed Youssef. Can you unmute your microphone, please?
دكتور أحمد تفتح الصوت.
دكتور أحمد.
عند ميوت. طيب ممكن احنا نعطي الفرصة للدكتور.
In the meanwhile, we will give the chance to Dr. Ibrahim. Okay, Dr. Ahmad, please go ahead. You have unmuted your microphone. We can hear you now. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. This meeting is beautiful, and Dr. Raed, in his elaborate criticism, has provided the most important contribution in this symposium, and those notes and critique needs to be heard by many of the leaders in this movement, because many were very fair and important. So I would like to thank him on behalf of all of us speaking from Gaza Strip for being so honest and frank, because these are issues that we actually faced or committed, but we may be ashamed of or not tackled quite as explicitly. As for the point made by Dr. Hussam, which is an important point, which is the idea of recognition, or whether it is the recognition of the state of the 1967. And when we talk to the West, we tried to understand what many of those politicians wanted to get to. They wanted two things. First of all, the recognition of Israel. And we told them that this is something that is not going to be offered by Hamas, because Hamas is a movement that is here to liberate the territory from the river to the sea. This is a waste of your time. This is not something we are going to compromise on. We have historical Palestine and the territory of historical Palestine. This generation and the next and the following are going to liberate and work to liberate this land. Of course, we have our understanding of the presence of Jews on the land of Palestine. They were present before the Zionist movement, and coexistence persisted for more than 3,000 years. We might consider coexistence, but to compromise on historical Palestine and the recognition of the full territory of Palestine, that's out of the question. And we have also written a letter in which more than 20 leaders and politicians from Hamas and the government were involved, and we issued this letter which said that you have to communicate rather than try to isolate Hamas movement. It was an important letter that was delivered to the quartet, to the international quartet, in its meeting in New York, it included 5 points. At least I have hinted at 3 of them, and it said that the government in Gaza was ready to negotiate and talk to the quartet and look into all ways of putting an end to the conflict and establish stability in the region. And this is, you say that Hamas was a movement, not a state, but it had a government, it had an authority, and the PLO has given you and appeased you and told you everything that satisfies you. However, you haven't been committed to your pledges and commitment. So we are not going to repeat the same mistake. So this was clear from the very beginning, and we said that this requires deliverables on the ground in order to reach to a point where we discuss the form or the nature of the state, the coming structure of the situation in Palestine and the referendum, and all Palestinians would be involved in this referendum, and it's going to prevail. So we will not agree to what the PLO agreed, and our vision and our principles and constants remain unshaken, and Israel has offered no concession and honored no pledge or commitment made in Oslo. So don't ask us for something that is beyond our capacity. So even if Hamas would give in or provide a formula or a language that is appeasing, our own people would not accept that. So for us, the ball is in the court of the Israelis. They have to withdraw from Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then afterwards we can resume talks in certain frameworks through the PLO, which is our interlocutor in the Oslo Accords. For us, we're not going to give in to any pressures by the Americans or the Europeans, and we will continue to persevere in our steadfastness for our cause, for our territory that was usurped by Western sponsorship, and we are going to persist in our resistance. And politics would be present and we can talk, but you have to prove your credibility even with the PLO, which you have forced and convinced to reach a compromise or an agreement where a Palestinian state can be established on the borders of 1967. But unfortunately, the West used to evade this, and they tried to get a concession from our side, but Hamas did not go easy on this or lenient on this. Based on the outcomes, we are now in a position, as Dr. Raed mentioned, we have to seek to lift the name of Hamas from the list of terrorism and also give Hamas the opportunity to get out of this cultural and political obesity, as you mentioned, by establishing a political party that can address the world in a political discourse and leave the dawah and resistance operation and work at different levels, and to focus on national consensus, which is going to be an overarching collective Palestinian umbrella. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. Now the floor goes to Dr. Ahmed Brahim. Dr. Brahim, are you with us? Have we lost communication? I'm sorry, he has an interview today because of the anniversary of Al-Nakba in 1948, sorry. Thank you so much for all the speakers and commentators. I will focus in those 2 minutes on something that is related to the methodology. In other words, when Dr. Youssef thankfully mentioned the idea of change as a researcher in politics. When I studied the experiences of nations in change, I found that any human group that was able to accomplish change has a particular characteristic. Most importantly, it can instill values in the communities and make those values acceptable for that community. And afterwards, this group would open up to the other components of the community, be it whether it works on a local level or an international level with the other components of the international community. And it is in this way that they can accomplish change.
So when we look at Hamas movement today, we see that it represents several values. For example, the value of the moderate Islam, the value of resistance. And I believe that the majority of Palestinians today are holding on these two values. And today, how can we make all of Palestine join these values? Here we have another requirement, which is the new generation, the Alpha generation. And this generation that started to appear in 2015 in the West Bank, taking into consideration that Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, that the Israelis start to call the lone wolves or the intifada of the individuals. This is, we can, with the what they are, with the achievement that they are making and the message that they want to deliver, which is the great Palestinian individual. And here it is very important for a movement for like Hamas is to respond to this variable, especially that through reading those these operations, those who are affiliated with Hamas and these lone wolf operations, they are no more than 17%. So what about the rest of those people who are not affiliated with Hamas? So how can, 3%. So how can Hamas accommodate the 97% of those, the others who are doing these operations? I'm talking about the flexibility of the approach and not the ideology. Finally, I would like to thank you, Dr. Sami, for all of your efforts. I believe, in conclusion, weighing the achievements is an important thing, but I believe today it is important to look into the mechanisms of amplifying the achievements. Taking into consideration the fact that there are achievements, indeed, especially if we take into consideration the age of Hamas or the challenges that it faced and how it managed to overcome. Today, there are parameters that can allow for the amplifying these achievements. And here I would like to reiterate on the importance of studying the Alpha generation in Palestine, because I couldn't find in a small research, I didn't see any research that looked into the Alpha generation, although I found over 50 studies, including the CIA Western studies, talking about how to deal with this generation. So it is, we need to deal with that, and maybe this could be one of the efforts of one of the centers that are engaged in this issue. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wright, and I would like to thank all those who shared with us this morning session. that was really rich, and we're going to build on it in the evening session as well as other sessions in the future. At the end of this session, I would like to thank Dr. Yusuf Rizqa, Dr. Ahmed Yusuf, and Dr. Muhammad Ibrahim Al-Madhoun, and Dr. Raed Al-Ayrat, as well as Dr. Hussam. And I would like to apologize on behalf of Dr. Rabbouh. He wanted to join us, but he is traveling and he couldn't get to a place where he can join our call. So I apologize on his behalf. Now we will have a break and we will get back after almost 1 hour and 10 minutes at the 3 o'clock Istanbul time in this session about the evaluation of Hamas experience. Peace be upon you.
شكرا لكم جميعا، بارك الله فيكم. الحقيقة كانت يعني مداخلات قيمة جدا وأنا شخصيا استفدت منها، وإن شاء الله سنضعها في كتاب كما ذكر الدكتور يوسف، فلكم طبعا أن تعمقوا ما كتبتوه، وسنعطي كل متحدث يعني حوالي 6 أسابيع حتى يعيد لنا الورقة بشكل جديد. السلام عليكم.
ابو العبيد تمام، كل شيء تمام، ما وصلوش بشوف.
الله يعطيك العافية يا دكتور.